one of the great figures in religious tradition as a forerunner of his logotherapy, or as he also called it, dimensional ontology. This was none other than the great Rabbi Yehuda Lev of Prague, known by the acrostic of his name, which is the Maharal of Prague. And Frankl says quite openly that that the Maharal was a very insignificant figure in his background. He mentions that he has indicated in several of his writings that had already indicated this, even though I cannot find those other mentions. I know where Frankl actually acknowledges the Maharal, that we know, but what else Frankl said explicitly about the Maharal of Prague, I'm not sure. However, going straight to the source, the Maharal, who incidentally was a forebear of Viktor Frankl as well. The Maharal lived in the times of the Renaissance. We can see how the theory of the Maharal is in many ways extraordinarily congruent with Frankl, or maybe we should put it the other way around. Frankl's work is extraordinarily congruent with that of his great predecessor, the Maharal of Prague. And this is very valuable because when we look at the source, we're actually able to clarify certain points in the work of Frankl himself. And so this is the substance of much of the second chapter of the book, The Rediscovery of the Human, Psychological Writings of Viktor E. Frankl on the Human and the Image of the Divine. And I termed this chapter a spiritual clarification of logotherapy, because I wanted to show in this book how this was the work of a major modern psychologist fits so remarkably with what he himself termed the higher or more inclusive dimension of theology. Okay, now basically the Maharal of Prague has a model of the human being which consists also of 3 elements plus a very important 4th element. The 3 elements are the bodily dimension of the human being, which in Hebrew is called gufni, physical. Then there is an intellectual, if you like, or an intellectual dimension, mental dimension, which is called chayuni, vital, self-conscious self. And then there is finally an element which is called the unitive, which mobilizes, harmonizes, and coordinates the physical and the mental dimensions of the human being. Now, these and similarly, the Maharal of Prague characterizes these elements as both Frankl and later Freud also would do in the following terms. The gufni, the physical dimension of human personality, is that which desires, which is appetitive, which wants, which has wishes. It is something which seeks gratification, whether it's for physical nature or whether it's some form of material aggrandizement. The chayuni, this mental self-conscious dimension, is one which is able to distance itself to some degree from the mere lower physical wanting self, and able to strategize about these needs. In other words, it's that part of the human being which observes itself, and it's able to. But by the same, that doesn't necessarily make it virtuous. It makes it strategic. It's able to look at the person, to examine the self, and to see, for example, to compare it with others, or to compare it with other perspectives, and so on and so forth. And then finally, there is this unitive dimension in the human being, which unifies both, which is a higher faculty, which is drawn towards meaning and purpose, And it is that faculty which is called unitive because it unifies the physical and the mental. It has the physical and the mental faculties at its disposal. And this corresponds to what Frankl called the noetic dimension, the higher noetic dimension, the meaning faculty in the human being. So this is something which is very very interesting. But the major point of clarification here is that the Maharal introduces a fourth element, or fourth dimension, which in a sense encompasses and regulates the whole lot. And this is, if you like, a spiritual dimension which actually orients all of these faculties and directs them. Primarily it orients what we call the unitive faculty, the highest of the three faculties. It directs that third faculty itself. And this is a very important thing to realize, because when we read the work of Viktor Frankl, we can be misled sometimes to think that what Frankl calls the noetic, the meaning faculty, the higher meaning faculty in the human being, one can be tempted to think that that is the same thing as the soul or the conscience. Now, the reality is that that meaning faculty which a human being has and is distinctly human is something which is open to a whole variety of meanings. The word meaning itself does not necessarily connote self-transcending spiritual meaning. A terrorist has got meaning. Even a hedonist can develop a philosophy, if you like, a meaning set which justifies and validates his or her desires. People have meanings. Most people, unless people are very, very unreflective and in their existence, people have a worldview, and it's the worldview which takes up residence, so to speak, in that noetic faculty, and that higher unitive faculty, that faculty which directs mind and body. The Maharala of Prague is very careful to point out that whilst this unitive faculty, this higher meaning faculty, has a potential for good, always concerned with meaning, has a potential for self-transcending meaning, it does not necessarily do so. And here is where we need a fourth element, which is, so to speak, the soul, the spirit of the whole lot. And it's this which ultimately guides the meaning faculty. It directs, orients the meaning faculty. So really, this meaning faculty, which Frankl calls noetic, should be the home, should be the residence of the soul or the conscience from a religious point of view, spiritual point of view. However, it can also be the home of ideologies which have bumped the spiritual out, so to speak, or repressed it. And here, the Maharala of Prague, in one of his writings, makes a very important distinction between two biblical figures in terms of this orienting dimension. He looks at Abraham on the one hand, and he looks at the prophet, the corrupt prophet Bilom, or Balaam as he's sometimes known, on the other. Now, what's the difference between Abraham and Bilom? Both very powerful personalities. Abraham was a person who was entirely given over to God, and his whole existence was one of this love of God and the service of God. Bilom, on the other hand, was a person who was wholly given over to his own desires. He was hired. He was hired to curse the Jewish people. Even though he had prophetic powers, he was prepared to utilize this simply for monetary gain. He was a person whose life was dominated by lust, And this, in fact, became his worldview. This enabled him to harness all of his remarkable powers to very undesirable ends. And so the Maharala of Prague, the Maharala of Prague sets out how the different orienting spirits in Abraham on the one hand and in Bilom on the other hand directed each of the other three faculties of the personality. So, what do we find in Abraham? We find that in the if you like the bodily, or they're sometimes called the somatic dimension, Abraham expressed abnegation of all unnecessary desire. He was a person who was prepared to subjugate his own desires to higher purpose. Bilom, on the other hand, was a person in this physical dimension who lusted for gross and unnatural gratification and money. What about the mental dimension? In the mental dimension, we find that Abraham is characterized by a supreme humility of thought. Bilom, on the other hand, is a mind which is distorted by arrogance. When it comes to the unity of the higher meaning faculty, Abraham has a global outlook of goodness and kindness, wants to benefit humanity and the world, draw it close to God. Bilom, on the other hand, is wholly oriented towards evil and harm. He's an instrument of destruction, and he puts himself up for higher in this dimension. So that there is, if you like, a controlling, an overall, there is an overall orientation of all of these three faculties in Bilom, which is towards self-gratification, total self-absorption. And in Abraham, on the other hand, it is one of total self-abnegation, total self-surrender to the purpose, to the will of God, and to the pursuit of goodness and kindness. So this is the fourth dimension, which orients all of those three faculties. Ideally, we would like to place, as I mentioned before, we would like to place this fourth dimension in the residence of the third dimension, the meaning faculty. That's what should be settled there. But we find that in the human psyche, it's very often some sort of a cultural ideology which has crept in and supplanted the soul in that higher meaning faculty. And this is something which is very important to understand. The human being has a capacity, because the human being has that higher meaning faculty. The human being has the ability to appreciate the divine. It has this potential to imitate God, but that potential is not necessarily activated. Whereas in Abraham, it is fully activated and it is fully oriented. And that is the significance of the tradition from Sinai. It was the purpose also of the Jewish people to be a light to the nations, in order to seek to activate that divine likeness within all humanity. In other words, that ability to form a worldview which is based on the imitation of God, and which would in turn regulate the other dimensions of human personality and human conduct. This quality, this power, is activated through the light which comes down from Sinai, and which, so to speak, switches on this and orients this authentic meaning potential within the human being. We don't always find that Frankl in his writings distinguishes between the noetic dimension and the soul or conscience, as it is open to confusion, because, as mentioned before, the soul and conscience should take up residence in the noetic dimension. But as Frankl also acknowledges in other places, the soul, so to speak, can be knocked out or subdued or suppressed by all sorts of cultural pathologies, all sorts of ideologies. He called it pathologies of the zeitgeist, of the spirit of the times. Now, this is and this is something actually which is important to realize, because whilst we readily recognize illnesses in the somatic and the psychological dimensions of human beings, we can see, for example, you can see schizophrenia, you can see bipolar disorder, you can see all sorts of disorders which might be as a result of various chemical imbalances, physiologically induced elements in personality. And we can also see a whole host of disorders which relate primarily, if you like, to the mental dimensions. There's anxiety, there is claustrophobia and agoraphobia, all sorts of issues which arise there. However, we're not necessarily so tuned to the concept of a pathology of the spirit itself. Now, that pathology of the spirit does not mean that the soul becomes sick. The soul is not sick. The divine image in the human being is not sick. It can be subdued. It can be submerged within the human being. But the meaning faculty in the human being, the noetic faculty, that higher faculty, that can be unwell. And it's a very strange thing. You might say, what business is that of psychology? Psychology is there to make people to feel better. It's there to allay anxiety. It's there to suppress deep-seated psychotic disorders and so on, and so to treat them. But if a person is functioning on those lower levels, but has a disordered noetic realm, in other words, let's take, for example, the concentration camp guard, who all day long is carrying out indescribable cruelties, comes home, puts on his slippers, takes the dog onto his lap, listens to Mozart, and is a wonderful family man. Is that person psychologically well? Is psychological wellness measured solely by how we feel in the somatic and the mental dimensions of personality? Is it possible, in other words, also for there to be a pathology if you like, in that noetic realm, in that realm which has to do with meaning? And indeed, we find there are cultures where there are if you like, value systems, which I think many people would describe as cruel and harsh and so on and so forth. Now, does that mean that the people are psychologically unwell? It's a very important and very interesting question, particularly if these cultures have existed for hundreds or even thousands of years. Is it possible to speak of a collective mental unwellness if people are functioning on the lower levels quite well? It's just that they have, if you like, a disturbed view of life. They are practicing some sort of barbaric existence at that level, but they function. They function. Anyway, I'll leave this question just for the side, but at all events, it is suggested by the Maharala of Prague that a person whose worldview is deeply disturbed, that this will actually percolate down into the lower faculties as well. It'll actually corrupt the somatic and mental dimensions of personality. But even if that is not the case, even if the person continues to function very well, whilst being a Nazi concentration camp guard, or by having some very disturbed, ethically disturbed worldview, that still in some way does not remove on that level, at the noetic level, all events, that pathological dimension personality. Anyway, I just mention that because this is a very important insight, something which is clarified in Frankl's own model. And Frankl actually seems to be saying this also, but he doesn't say it with the same clarity as the Maharala of Prague, is that yes, there are three dimensions to personality: the bodily, the mental, and that unitive meaning faculty. But we have to know also that there is a question of how that unitive faculty, and consequently the other dimensions of personality, which the unitive faculty regulates, how that higher faculty is itself directed and how is itself oriented. Very important issue. Now, basically, it is the fact that the human being has this ability to realize and actualize and manifest the soul within him or herself that gives a human being freedom. Because if we and freedom in the sense of Frankl's work, and in the sense also of the traditional Maharala Frog, because what, after all, is freedom? Freedom is choice. The choice we have is the choice whether to follow interests, in other words, dispositions, or to follow that spiritual path, which itself is the concept of interestlessness, by which I mean the truly spiritual human being is a person not who gives up on eating and drinking and all the other needs and relationships and so on and so forth, but is the person who is, in a sense, able to suspend the dominance of interests in their own life. They're able to say, a spiritual person is able to say, the question for me is not what do I want, but rather what is wanted of me. If I live my life according to that concept, that I'm asking not what I want and what I need, but what is wanted of me, that doesn't mean that I'm going to give up eating and drinking, all relationships and all different things of that sort. But what it's going to do is it's going to give me the power to discriminate amongst or to discern amongst all of those experienced needs, desires, interests, and so on and so forth, to see which are worthy and which are not worthy, which need modification, which don't need modification. So it's the essence of the self-transcending spiritual purpose is that that person is not dominated by their own perceived interests. Rather, they carry out a constant review of the interests which push and pressure, whether these are interests which arise in the bodily domain, in the mental domain, in the cultural, ideological domain, and the person is saying, I am above all of this. I am able to submit all of this to a scrutiny and to measure it and to ascertain which of these interests, which of these values will run my life in the light of my self-transcendence towards God. So that is, in other words, the spiritual standpoint of the soul is the idea of interestlessness. In other words, the ability not to be dominated by perceived interests, but to adjudicate amongst them, to estimate. Whereas, where this spirit of self-transcendence does not exist, where the soul, so to speak, is not revealed in the human being, what the human being then, the choice the human being then has is a choice between interests. The choice which interests to follow, by which interest to be dominated and to be led. So the essential freedom of the human being, whether in the religious tradition, whether in Frankl's work too, and we can discern it, is shall I be led by perceptions, values, and so on and so forth, or shall I instead and so to speak, reveal within myself that spiritual dimension, that truly self, which is above all interests? That's what and that is the real choice. The choice is not, do I want chocolate ice cream or do I want strawberry ice cream? Do I want power? Do I want power? Do I want fame? That is a very low order of freedom. That is just a choice which impulse to follow, which drive to follow. The ultimate choice, the true freedom is, am I going to be led by my lower self, or am I going to be led by my higher self? That's the choice. So that is something which also is crystallized when we look at the model of human personality in the writings of the Maharala Frog. This is it's a remarkable study to make, to compare Frankl's work and Maharal's work. The Maharal clarifies what is not always so crystal clear in Frankl, but when we look again and again in Frankl's work, we do find that his model does form a broad apposition, a broad congruence with that of the Maharal of Prague. Now, the other crucial and fascinating thing which the writings of the Maharal do for us is to give content to what Frankl says when he writes, the ultimate discovery of the human being is the imitation of God. Now, that remarkable statement by Viktor Frankl, that the true discovery of the human being is the imitation of God, is the statement not of a theologian, but of a psychologist. That's what makes it so exciting and so important. And what Frankl is saying there is that the human being is that the imitation of God means that we are supposed to imitate the attributes of God. In other words, the kindness of God, the judgment of God, the qualities, those godly ways. That is what the imitation of God actually means here. Now, what that also means is that there are certain objective and universal contents of human conscience. It's not any meaning goes. It's not that case at all. Human beings are meaning-seeking people. They live by worldviews. But what Frankl says is that the self-transcending human being, which is the true human potential, transcends towards God ultimately, and that means imitation of the divine. And that means also that the human being has built in as much as the human being possesses a soul, the human being has built in an objective moral structure of personality. To be human and consciously human at this level where the soul is revealed means you may not kill. It means that there is an objective sexual morality. It means a person should not steal, and so on and so on. Now, the Maharal actually does the extraordinary thing of creating a model which relates the structure of human personality to this actual ethical template of the Noahide laws, the 7 universal Noahide laws. And this is something which I don't know if I can explain it fully. It's explained in this book. But basically what he does is he looks at the different dimensions of the human being. He says the human being, as we mentioned before, has this physical dimension, this mental self-conscious dimension, and has the unitive dimension, which combines the both. It's a higher meaning faculty. And the human being also exists in terms of personal relationships with God and in between person and person interpersonal relationships. And the human being also has a relationship to nature. Very briefly, there is a matrix which comes out of these different dimensions of different faculties of the human mind, human psyche, and the interpersonal personal relations, the relationship with nature, which generate the fields of the 7 Noahide laws. So that, for example, in the interpersonal dimension, or the personal dimension, let us say, the physical dimension is sexual morality. Sexual morality has to do with human identity. It has to do with the question of who I am and what I am before God. And this implies and relates to the union of man and woman, which has a certain parallelism also with certain, what we call certain dimensions of the divine, what's called the transcendent and the immanent. It has to do with how I constitute myself as an identity before God. Similarly, also, therefore, what is crafted from the family life, the life which is created out of a sexual bond, so to speak, a legitimate sexual bond. That's a very important dimension of human identity in the physical dimension. Then in the mental realm, that dimension has to do then with the idea of the negation of idolatry, because the healthy mind is one which does not fetishize a particular aspect of reality, which is what idolatry is. Idolatry takes something which God created and makes it absolute. That's a disease of the mind. It's a failure of the mind. And then in the unitive realm, which is the mind and body, mind and body together as a living being, then in the relationship with God, that is that has to do with life, and life is and the stamp of life, which is the divine image in the human being, and the so to speak, that the sin, the typical sin or the typical sickness of the unitive faculty in the human being is expressed in the idea of the hubris of blasphemy, that the human being rebels against self-transcendence. And so then also in this interpersonal dimension, in the physical dimension, it's the idea is my physical, how must I regulate myself in the physical dimension vis-a-vis other people? Not by not stealing, by not seeking their property. How does the interpersonal dimension relate to the mental dimension of personality? It means that I have to have a concept of justice, impartiality, fairness. And how does it relate then to the unitive dimension, body and soul? Not to kill. Because that's why body and soul, that's life. And the divine, the rebellion, the foundation of prohibition of killing is the idea of the sanctity of life as bearing the stamp of the divine within it. Now, what I've said now is very, very concise, and it needs to be, to see what I'm talking about, it's desirable for you to read the book. However, the point I want to make is that the Maharala of Prague does an extraordinary task of relating the structure of human personality, which comes out in 7 dimensions, and relationships and interconnections, and connecting those with the 7 Noahide laws to tell us that the ordered human personality is one which is inherently ethical and moral, based on universal values. That the human personality has a moral structure. So that for me is an absolutely fascinating concept, and it supplies content to that which Frankl said quite boldly, where he spoke about the ultimate discovery of the human being as a personality is the imitation of God. The Maharala gives us the content. And the truth be told, Frankl also is talking about morality a lot in his writings. And I can give you some examples of how he does it. In fact, you see him, with the extent to which he's conscious of the Noahide laws per se is not always clear. But you can see that basically he is relating the idea of morality to an orderly structure of human personality all the time. So, for example, we'll see now, and we'll see how this comes out shortly. I'll shortly give you some examples. Now, how does all of this relate to logotherapeutic practice? Logotherapy, we have to remember this, is Frankl's supplement to empirical psychotherapies. It's one aspect. Obviously, logotherapy by itself does not treat the whole person. It's not an exclusive treatment for personality disorders, but it is a crucial dimension which invokes the meaning or spiritual dimension in the human being. So, first thing, Frankl says, logotherapeutic practice, the very first thing it has to do is to distinguish the real I. What is the essential I? Who am I? I am, of course, a person with a body and a mind and a soul and meaning complexes and all of that. But the real I is, and the ultimate, the foundational I is that my spiritual self. The real I is a soul, a divine likeness. That is the fundamental and essential I. And the first thing we have to do in any situation, when we're whether it's a psychological problem or whatever it might be, or an external predicament, we have to be able to say, okay, I'm experiencing this and I'm experiencing that, and I have these feelings and these emotions and these anxieties and so on. But is all of that the real I, or is it something which I have? Am I anxious, or do I have anxiety? There is an I which is intact. There is an I which is whole. There is an I which is healthy and spiritual. And it is situated in the midst of all of this. I don't deny all of the problems which I have with internal or external, but I must distinguish the real I. It is not I who desire this. It is not I who have this craving. This craving is something which is attending me, which is bothering me. But the true I is something which is deeper and above and above it all. So first thing is separate out the spiritual dimension from the whole world maelstrom of all of these personality elements around it. Second thing to do is to the application of an ethical worldview to the individual circumstances in which I'm found, in which I find myself. Frankl actually, whilst he didn't know much about the Noahide laws, he spoke about what he called a very interesting thing. He spoke about the 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments are not the same as the Noahide laws. There's an overlap between the Noahide laws and the 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments were given to the Jewish people. The Noahide laws were given to all humanity. But he would still use the 10 Commandments, as many people do, as this concept of this universal message. And it does overlap to a certain extent. And he would speak about the 10,000 applications of the 10 Commandments. In other words, the 10 Commandments, he said, they are refracted. They apply to every situation of our lives. We have to, whatever we are, there is an ethical path to be taken through the application of these universal objective laws. And that means, in sharpened focus, that means that we have to understand in every situation we're asked to respond. And we need to respond in an ethical way, in accordance with divine law, this divine template of norms and values. It's also a very important point. And the final thing here is that Frankl, in the purpose of logotherapy, is not necessarily to tell the person what to do, but to